Lion in the Wind, Chapter 23. In a stunning victory for the Sadizan army, a late entrant in the war, the last pockets of Gorg and Midizin resistance fell today on the heels of a lightning-fast campaign that lasted just 10 days and swept aside the two opposing armies with ease. As of noon today, the Gorg and Midizin governments have unconditionally surrendered. Our news sources tell us that the first contact between Yigzin and Sadizan forces was near the Notadar River, just 12 miles north of the Gorg capital of Oyavar. We are also told that some of the now famous Bergen Lions, who have been so instrumental in driving back the joint Gorg and Midizin armies in recent weeks, were also present. There is no word yet on what will happen next, but some believe that the General Secretary will move quickly to restore peace between the four nations. The National News Network will strive to keep you apprised of any further developments in this story as they become available. Bergen turned off the television and leaned back in his chair. "The war's over?" asked Persia. "Apparently so," said Bergen. "So then Chagani will be all right?" she asked. Bergen nodded. "He very likely will. I don't know of any further dangers he might encounter, except possibly some scattered pockets of resistance or problems in the post-war cleanup." "Will he be coming home soon?" Bergen shook his head. "Unlikely. They still have a lot to do. They probably won't be allowed to come home for some time. Possibly even as long as a year." Persia fidgeted nervously. "Oh, I can't wait that long. I want them to come home now." Bergen smiled. "I feel the same way. I anxiously want to see what's become of them, and how they've grown these past several months." "Do you think Chagani will be scarred by his experiences?" asked Persia. Bergen chuckled. "Scarred? Not really. Some buffing, and maybe a little grinding, and he'll be good as new. I don't mean his body, Dad. I mean, his mind. What will he be like after all he went through? I've seen pictures of what it was like out there, and they scared me. To be there, too." Her voice trailed off as an expression of sadness and worry crossed her face, which was soon followed by a river of tears. "I don't want to think about it anymore, Dad. I just want things back to the way they were, back when things were happy and life was simpler," she sobbed. Bergen knelt down and embraced her lovingly. "I don't know what this war may have done to him. We can only pray that he is all right. But we must not forget about the others. They're just as important to us as he is. Although they haven't been out there as long as he has, I'm sure they experienced many of the same things he did. We can only hope and pray to Mashwa that they are also healthy when they return to us," said Bergen. "Do you think he'll be different?" asked Persia. Bergen nodded. "Very likely. But I want him to be just the way he was," shouted Persia. "I know that you love Chagani like a son, sweetheart, and you two spend a lot of time together, but the other lions are just as important to us as he is, and they all look up to you as their mother. As a parent, although superficially, you can't be partial to any one of them. You must love them all equally." Persia sniffed sadly as she tried to hold back her tears. "I'll do whatever I can. I'm still not good at this parenting thing. It seems far too sad, and painful, and full of tears." Bergen laughed. "I know, dear, but we'll come through this together." Persia smiled through her tears and then gave Bergen a wet, sloppy cat kiss. "Thanks, Dad." Black studied several field intercepts on his computer, and then turned to Elgar. He then folded his hands and grinned devilishly. It would appear that the post-war efforts are progressing nicely. If things continue as they are, we should be able to put this whole messy affair behind us very soon. "What are the efforts to rebuild the Gorg and Midizin nations?" asked Elgar. "The Midizin can rot in Varric for all I care. They're a pack of filthy, dirty, backstabbing, gutless freaks. They should be wiped from existence just like they tried to do with us." "I have absolutely no pity for them," growled Black. "Well, I don't believe that genocide of the Midizin race will be the best move for us to make at this time. Instead, I believe we should take steps to prevent them from ever gaining a foothold within the Gorg government again." Black perked up slightly. "What would those be?" If we help the Gorg rebuild their nation, it will, in turn, make the Gorg a strong ally of ours who will be willing to do our bidding should we require their services in the future. This includes eliminating the Midison for us should such a thing ever be required. Black appeared perplexed at this. Why do you think that would work? He asked. What good have the Midison been to the Gorg? They've treated them like slaves and inferior beings. If we instead treat them with dignity and benevolence, despite having been their enemy for a time, they will gladly turn away from their alliance with the Midison and side with us, thus making them a useful ally. Black grinned demoniacally as he folded his hands thoughtfully. Elgar, I like the way you think. See what you can do to ensure that our government begins offering aid and assistance to the Gorg as much as possible. Tell them it'll be a good thing for both nations, but most especially for ours, as it'll keep the Gorg from attacking us again. Elgar scribbled several notes on a small notepad in his hands. Done. And what about the lions? What do we intend to do with them? He asked. Black's eyes narrowed. My plans for them have not changed. But what if they discover what we're planning and turn against us? Black selected a folder from a nearby pile and then slid it across the desk. Elgar picked it up and studied its contents briefly, and then cocked an eyebrow in interest. How far along is this? He asked. The prototype can be ready for use in as little as 3 years. If it performs well enough in its field tests, we can begin producing thousands of them a month until our army is large enough to be unstoppable, even by the lions. Elgar frowned. If the Bergen lions get a hold of these, they'll tear them apart. Black grinned devilishly. This new robot has been designed with that consideration in mind. Elgar was surprised at this. So it can destroy them? He asked. If we need it to, yes. Elgar grinned. Well then, clearly we have nothing to worry about. Black laughed darkly. We never did. So what of the lions? With this new machine in the works, of what value are they to us? They have the advantage of speed and mobility, whereas this machine will be the muscle of our operation. Together they will be unstoppable. And what if they don't go along with our plans? Black grinned devilishly. Then we will simply eliminate them. That has always been the plan. Either they serve us willingly, or they will be destroyed. Delgra stepped out of his car and studied the facility grounds. One of the officers raced over to him, stopped and then saluted. We've checked the entire facility, sir. It's completely intact, said the officer. Has EOD cleared all of the buildings? Asked Delgra. Every one of them, sir. They're even going through and double-checking everything right now, but so far the facility is clean. Nobody's been here since we left, said the officer. Delgra found this rather unusual. Especially since the Gorg had clearly controlled this area for several months. He reached inside his car, pulled out his laptop, and laid it on the hood of the car. He then worked for several minutes to access the security systems in the facility, and soon downloaded the security logs for the past several months. A script quickly parsed through the data and brought up a handful of entries that indicated possible entry into the facility. All of them turned out to be false alarms triggered by large animals that were in search of food and had tripped the alarms. He quickly logged into the facility mainframe and found all of his security systems intact and untouched. He closed the laptop and tucked it under his arm. Lieutenant, have you verified that the administration building is safe to enter? He asked. The officer nodded. It's squeaky clean, sir. All right, then make sure you get me your report once you finish securing the facility. Yes, sir, said the officer before running off to finish his work. Delgra then drove down to the administration building and stepped inside. Aside from some dust, and the obvious signs of a hasty departure, the building was exactly how he'd left it. He walked down the hallway to his office and found the door partially ajar. He carefully pushed it open and found Odivian sitting at the desk grinning back at him. Do you normally leave highly sensitive laboratory facilities unguarded for months at a time? He asked. A gigantic smile grew across Delgra's face. Odivian, you old dog. How the blazes have you been? He said excitedly. Odivian stood up, walked over to Delgra, and gave him a giant bear hug before stepping back several paces to study him in detail. "You look a bit paler than I remember," he said with a smirking grin. Delgra smiled and shrugged. "Well, you know. Desk job and all. They tend to lock you in the darkest possible hole in the wall and feed you only bread and water until your work is done," he chided. Odivian laughed. "Well, that's what you get for being a bureaucrat." Delgra smirked. "Bureaucrat indeed. I'll show you a bureaucrat," he laughed. "Either way, I see your security penetration skills are still as sharp as ever," he continued. "How so?" "You got in without being detected." Odivian chuckled. "Actually, I didn't." Delgra cocked his head in confusion. "You had to have. There's nothing in the logs indicating your entry into the facility." "That's because I cheated. I knew how to get into the security logs and delete the evidence of my entry. So I did because I wanted to surprise you when you arrived." Delgra laughed. "I should have known. So tell me, how have you been the past couple months?" Odivian shrugged. "I went over to visit Oik, just as you asked, and then spent the rest of my time there fighting against the Gorg. Oddly enough, I also ended up becoming friends and allies with one of them." "You became allies with a Gorg? How?" "Why?" asked Delgra. Odivian grinned. "That's going to take some explaining. And I think you should be sitting down when you hear this, because if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't believe it myself." Delgra pulled up a chair, sat down, and crossed his arms. "All right, I'm listening." Welk walked into the tent and waved to the others as he sat down. "Any luck?" asked Sims. Welk grunted. "Command still hasn't got any work for us. Apparently the citizens are doing most of the heavy lifting since we're so short on manpower," said Welk. Pentel handed him a ration pack. "Well, it beats being out in the woods for weeks on end. At least here we get fresh food and somewhere to sleep other than a muddy foxhole." Welk held up his ration pack and said, "I don't exactly call this fresh." Sims laughed. "Well, at least it's food." Welk snorted. "I wouldn't even call it that," he said as he tore into the pack. "So what are we gonna do about the lions?" asked the soldier. "What do you mean?" asked Pentel. The soldier shrugged. "Well, I can't think that we'd want those things hanging around camp getting bored out of their skull. They ought to have something to do." Chigani looked at Pentel and said, "While I do not see the need for us to leave camp at this time, it may be a good idea for my siblings to engage in patrols of their own to aid the efforts of the citizens. Even though there are many of them, there is a lot of land to cover." Pentel looked at Welk and then Sims. "He's got a point. The lions could be a great help to the citizens." Sims snorted. "Have you seen how good the citizens can see and hear? They could probably hear a fly sneeze half a mile away. Their senses are not that acute." "Even ours aren't that good," said Chigani. "Maybe not, but they're still pretty sensitive." Welk pointed his thumb at the tent door and asked, "So, you want me to go ask the general if that's all right?" Pentel shook his head. "Nah. If they want us, they'll ask." Sims laughed. "Well, given that nobody ever wants to volunteer for anything, if they went, they'd probably end up with the worst duties." Pentel laughed. "Yeah, no kidding. Sir, this might sound silly, but now that the war is over, what's going to happen to our unit?" asked one of the soldiers. "We won't know for a while." "Actually, I believe I already do," said Chigani. The men all looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" asked Welk. "According to military law, being sentient, self-willed beings who were conscripted into service for this country, we are entitled to be relieved of duty once our services are no longer required in the defense of this country. Since the war is now over, it is likely that we will be released soon to return to our parents once it is determined that our presence is no longer required. As such, once we are no longer members of the military, it is only logical that this unit will be dissolved, and all members of it will be reassigned to other units," said Chigani. "In other words, we're getting disbanded," said a soldier. Chigani nodded. Pentel shrugged. That sounds about right. But what if you're needed again? If we are asked to return to military service, we will comply, said Chigani. Well, then I guess we should enjoy what time we have left with the lions, said Sims. The other men all nodded in agreement. This made Chigani smile. 3 months later. Persia sat on top of a parapet of the outer wall of Black's Northern Robotics facility and shivered slightly as she huddled beneath a thick pillowed blanket. She looked out across the seemingly endless miles of open prairie that lay beyond the facility as snow began to fall gently around her. She loved snow. It was a curious and cold wonder that tickled her nose and teased her senses. It was also fun to play in. She grinned at the thought and then rested her chin on her paws as she waited in anticipation for the return of the lions. She'd held this vigil every night for over 4 months as summer wound down into fall and then early winter as the first snowstorm of the season bore down on them. Finally, the falling snow grew thick enough that she decided it was time to give up for the night and go inside. While she didn't want to leave, she knew that it did little good to wait in the cold if she couldn't see who or what was coming. She soon stood up and started to collect her blanket when the clouds parted, pouring brilliant white rays of light down onto the newly fallen snow. She looked out across the prairie briefly and then turned back to the blanket. She then paused as something caught her eye. She turned back towards the prairie, but only saw more snow as it came down in thick, heavy sheets. She blinked and shook her head. "Nah, I'm seeing things," she said to herself. Just then a glistening field of golden forms emerged from the snow, contrasting sharply against the extensive fields of white before vanishing again behind another wall of snow. Persia's heart pounded in anticipation. Was this really what she'd been waiting for? Was it really her children? She shook her head in disbelief. "Come on, Persia. Think. You're seeing things," she said as she chided herself for allowing her imagination to get the better of her. She turned, picked up her blanket, shook the snow off of it and carefully tossed it on her back. She then turned back towards the prairie one last time, and let out a roar. She froze in surprise as her cry was answered by a chorus of 100 other feline voices. She inhaled deeply, and roared again. It was soon answered by other roars. She immediately dropped her blanket and sped across the parapet, down the stairs, through the main gate, and out onto the prairie, nearly falling several times as her paws slipped on the newly fallen snow. But soon she was forced to stop as a wall of snow enveloped her, making it impossible to see anymore. She anxiously waited as the snow swirled around her in thick, angry spirals before it parted a few moments later. What appeared before her made her heart nearly leap out of her chest. "Hello, Mother," came a deep, rich voice that she recognized immediately. Persia felt like her chest was going to explode with joy. Despite the cold, she leapt at Chigani, embraced him, and nuzzled him affectionately as she purred with jubilation. After several moments she released him and stared lovingly into his eyes. "I've missed you," she said. Chigani smiled. "We missed you too." Persia grinned with pride as more and more lions began appearing out of the blowing snow around her. Chigani stared at her in concern as she shivered in the snow. "You look cold," he said. "Actually, I'm freezing," said Persia sheepishly. "Then let's go see Dad. He'll want to know we're home." Persia smiled happily, bounced joyfully in the snow, and then followed the lions back to the facility. As she did, Brakeman watched them with interest from the top of one of the parapets. "I wonder what it would be like to have a family like that, rather than just being their protector. I think it would be nice," he thought to himself. "Do you really desire the love and companionship of a family that much?" Came Mashua's voice in his mind. Brakeman paused to think about this. Well, they seem so happy. And they're never lonely, because they know they have someone they can come home to. But I have nobody. He grinned sheepishly. "Well, except you." Mashua laughed kindly. Brakeman sighed. "Still, I think I'd like to have something like that," he said. "With a family there is both joy and sorrow, blessing and sacrifice, happiness and grief. For every good thing that you gain, you will be required to sacrifice something in return. Are you willing to do that? Asked Mashwa. Brakeman thought about this for a moment, and then said, yeah, I am. Then these, whom you have been tasked to protect, I bequeath to you as family. Brakeman blinked in surprise. Really? You're serious? I am. Now go to them and welcome your new brothers and sisters home. Brakeman quickly leapt off the parapet and hurried down the stairs with excitement, rushing through the courtyard and up to Persia and Chagani as they stepped through the main gate. He then stood and stared at them excitedly, not knowing what to say. After a bit, he smiled, and said, Hi, Mom. Persia nodded. Hello, Brakeman. Your brothers and sisters have just returned home. Why don't you say hi to them? Said Persia. Brakeman was shocked. What Mashwa had said had indeed come true. He was now part of a family, and a big one at that. Hello, little brother, said Chagani. Brakeman grinned. Wow, when Mashwa grants a request, he really goes all out, he thought with excitement. Hey, let's go inside and tell Dad you're home, he said. Chagani nodded.